Well, thanks for joining us for really an exciting panel here this afternoon. My name is Laura Dimino. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for Rural Pennsylvania. And our panel today, or our concurrent session, is called If We Build It, Will They Stay? Minding the Gap Between Policy and Infrastructure Deployment and Leveraging Innovative Investments. Very long title. And with us today we have three individuals who are helping to solve all the challenges that we were talking about this morning. Brave souls dedicating lots of energy and resources to trying to provide broadband to communities not served or underserved. And so our process today, we're not gonna have any slides. We're gonna be conversational. And we have a loose format, and we're gonna kind of go in the order that our panelists are seated. We're gonna start with Brian. And I'm gonna briefly introduce them. Their biographies are in the agenda that you have for today in the booklet, but I'll make a few comments, start them off with a question. Brian will take about 10 minutes, and then we'll go to Jennifer, and then down to Dave. Do you want to take any questions after presentations?
No.
Hold them to the end?
I'm totally kidding.
She's pretty adamant about it. I wasn't even sure. We have a small group, so I'm glad to see if we've got especially a clarification question, something you really want to ask. I think we would all entertain that possibility. So Brian is a chief investment officer at Connect Humanity. He's had over 17 years working in investment and strategy, various sorts, and I really love the following phrase. He works in impact investing across asset classes. And I am not a financial expert by any means, but I know that in his presentation he's going to help explain what this means. So Brian, can you get us started today and talk a little bit about the funding landscape? I think we all have a pretty good sense of how infrastructure does get done and some of the funding streams we have for that. And then get into talking about community broadband and how you get that done.
Yeah, absolutely. So Connect Humanity, nonprofit impact investor, advancing digital equity. That's kind of the tagline. I think what that means in practice is when we looked at the funding landscape, we had a whole conversation earlier today about what's publicly available. So there's a good chunk of that money. Some of the other pockets that we've seen, philanthropy isn't materially at the table, at least with infrastructure. I dare say, affordability devices and literacy as well. But then what else is available? And so, we've talked to some investors who are more on like the municipal financing side of it. There are pros and cons with that, right? Minimum check sizes, certain level of transaction costs. It rules out a lot of communities that may not either want to bond for something or may not even have access to municipal capital markets. What's left after that? And I think one of our concerns has been there's not much. There is a huge heavyweight in private equity. But when you think about capital drives a lot of incentive. And so would you as a community want to take private equity money on to be the main sponsor or funder of your broadband infrastructure? And so it was in that kind of mosaic, if you will, where we started Connect Humanity a few years ago to be an alternative capital provider. If we were to clean sheet how you financed broadband for low-income and rural communities, what types of financing tools might those communities need and want? And so that really was our overarching question we started with. And so, as an investor, and when I think about broadband, relatively newer to the broadband space actually, so I come more from the investment side of things. When I hear broadband, I hear bandwidth consumption that's growing like 36% year over year for the last 15 years and expected to continue that pace for the next 10 years. From that, I hear utility-like demand. I hear low volatility. I hear predictability. all these phrases as an investor where it's like, that actually sounds relatively low risk. And so why is the only other major capital provider at the table outside of federal state grants, why is that private equity? Because when I hear low volatility and predictability, I hear single digits interest rates. Private equity, when they come in, they're looking for 30-40% easy, right? And so another stat for folks, over the last, I would say maybe from maybe 2019, but certainly starting in 2020 through to about 2022, 23, the 50 largest private equity infrastructure funds on average each raised $2.5 billion each. And so there's a lot of money to be made in broadband, and they know it. And so not all that money is going into ISPs, last mile and type of service. A lot is, but not all of it. A lot's going into data centers as well. But one of the things I often try to caution communities is to say, we kind of learned this lesson about 20 years ago. What happens when you have material amounts of private equity going into infrastructure? Take out broadband and digital for a second and just put in any other types of infrastructure. Roads, tunnels, bridges, parking meters in Chicago. That's probably the biggest case study, right? Like early 2000s, this must have been like 02 or something. The day after private equity buys out from the city their parking meters, parking goes from like 50 cents to $5 overnight. They just made the switch. Starts pricing out low income folks who are relying on that as a way to drive into the city for their jobs. And so we know generally the arc of the story, what happens when we privatize infrastructure. So in all of that, we started really just talking to communities like, what does your pro forma look like? What would a network in this community look like? Given the expected take rates and the projected ARPUs, how much cash flow could this network generate? And what we started noticing was it really depended on how the network was designed and operated. In a lot of the more traditional business models where we saw incumbents going into communities and just saying, hey, I'm going to build it here. I'm going to assume, $70, $80 ARPU, even though it's a relatively low income neighborhood. And I'm going to slap a 20 to 30% take rate assumption on this. That was like the standard. We talked to so many larger ISPs where they say that so frequently. It's like, wait, we were just talking to you about the Northeast. Now you're talking about the South, and it's the exact same assumption. And so we started digging a little bit more. It's like, what goes behind your assumption for that? And it was nothing. It was really just repetition from history, right? And so on the flip side, when we started talking to some other ISPs, we started hearing things like, well, we held a series of focus groups. We worked with this community anchor institution. We talked to this HBCU. We worked with these nonprofit organizations. This church that 80% of the community went to, we worked with their pastors to understand what the connectivity need was. And it was through these conversations we triangulated where we wanted to build the network, where we wanted to run the fiber, through this elementary school where most of the population lived around, et cetera. And every Saturday, we're hosting a digital literacy seminar at the local library that we're paying out of OpEx because we believe it drives our retention and therefore our business economics. And so we're kind of like, well, holy shit, those were two completely different approaches to fundamentally the same service, internet service provision. And so what we started thinking was, there seems to be what we started calling community-centric ISPs, folks who worked with the community to design, build, and operate the network in the way that the communities needed them to be designed, built, and operated. And they started seeing take rates of like 60 to 80%. ARPUs were lower, right? Lower income communities, they were still looking at like $40, $50. Unclear what ACP is going to do to that. But it completely reversed the economics. And so what we started doing on the investment team was to then say, how can we create financing products that enable that work, that is flexible and understanding of broadband economics with that type of trajectory, rather than the off-the-shelf, big telco 20% take rate at $80 unaffordable rates type of thing. So I can get more into some of those products. I think two that I might highlight, it's not even really products, but I would say one is, one question we get a lot actually is, what do we have like standards, right? Like we'll never work with WISP or satellite. We're a bit more pragmatic in that way. So both on the technology side and on the ownership side, our gold standards are fiber to the home, community owned, and that can mean a lot of things. But if fiber to the home can't work, to the premise, wireless. Then there are communities where it's going to be really challenging without satellite in some way. Same thing on the ownership side. And so how can we enable community ownership, whether that's municipal owned and operated or just municipal owned, or one of the models we're looking at in rural Louisiana is creating a sale leaseback model where the ISP is getting $6, it's a 10 mil bill, 6 mil is out of grant, 4 mil is what the ISP is putting in. And it was always odd to me where it's like, how do you put in $4 but then you own all $10, right? Like that's strange. And so what if we help the community create a 501c3 broadband foundation that would buy the network assets from the ISP after it was built? And so we're providing the financing to the community to buy $4 million off of the ISP. That's the money they put in. 6 mil is passed through, right? That was federal state grants. The ISP leases it back to provide internet service on top of it, and then we set the leaseback payment to be equal to our debt service. So it effectively is a pass-through. Over the course of 10 years, the community will own the infrastructure outright. And I think one of the things we wanted to prevent was the ISP was starting to say things like, oh, that low-income community over there in that pocket, we're going to put them in phase 3. And phase 3 is kind of code for never going to happen. And so by using capital as a tool for power for the community, they can then say, no, we want that community up front because we're buying all the CapEx, this is ours. The ISP is agreeing to it, and what it's been helpful with is deciphering who is actually mission aligned, who actually wants to serve these communities. And for less mission aligned ISPs, we'll hear things like, no, we're going to make our money off the infrastructure. I thought you were an internet service provider, right? And so that, little clues like that, how they just, what's on their bill of materials, are they doing one strand of fiber versus, really building for the future? All of these things to give us a sense of are for just to oversimplify, a bad actor or not. And so the ISP is going along with this because they can then say, I've offloaded all of my CapEx risk. All I got to worry about now is pricing to my OpEx, which should also make it more affordable, right? Because you don't have to make back both. I have no idea where I am in the 10 minutes.
Perfect time, actually.
Okay.
That was like 10 minutes. Good job. Any burning questions or clarifications people want to ask Brian right away? Okay, save it for later then. All right, our next speaker, Jennifer Wakeman, is the Executive Director of Drive, great name. And this is, as I understand, an organization that does a lot of things in the area of economic development, including an incredible wireless network that you've set up across 5 counties. So I'm going to turn it over to you to start talking about that model. However you want to go about this, if you want to talk about how this operates or challenges you faced. And
How much time do we have?
okay,
Yeah,
10 minutes.
10 minutes, okay. I'll make it quick. We started pre-COVID, 2018. Back up. Drive is an economic development entity. I am an economic developer who fell backwards into broadband. And some days I regret it, but, you live and learn a lot of things. But I met a lot of cool people along the way and learned a lot of stuff, so I guess that's a good thing. We started in 2018. We serve now 5 counties. We were originally a 2-county cog. It was Columbia and Montour County. Fun fact, Montour County is geographically the smallest the smallest county in the state. And so, great place to do a wireless pilot study. So, the beauty of being a public entity is that you can get people to do all sorts of weird things because they think it's for the public good. I mean, it is for the public good. But when you come in and say, you could help us out and it would be really cool, and they're like, that sounds great. So we have built a 4-tower, and I use the term tower loosely because they're not all towers. 4-tower network in 2018, all line of sight technology, just to see how well it would go. The ultimate goal was trying to get to the northern end of Montour County where they were running on really bad DSL that I could tell you horrible stories about that I won't, from a company that starts with a V. So we built out the network and we got $300,000 from Geisinger, who is a major healthcare institution. If you don't know that, their headquarters is in Danville, where our headquarters are. And they said, yeah, we'd be happy to play ball with that. We have, to this day, a major piece of our network sits on top of they built a really nice, pretty building, and then we slapped a bunch of wireless stuff on top of it. It's really cool looking. They Photoshop it out when they take pictures of it. Really, I've looked. I'm like, Photoshop, okay. So we built that network, and it was successful, but we found that line of sight technology has a lot not going for it. Particularly when you were in rural Pennsylvania where we have, mountains and trees. So the first network, those 4 towers, I think it cost us like just over $200,000 to build it at like a drop in the bucket. And we had a lot of interest to use the network, but not able to serve a lot of people. Like the number of white dots on the map versus the number of green dots on the map. The green were the people we served, and the white were the ones who called that we couldn't reach, was significant. Fast forward 2020, COVID, and by the time we got to March of 2020, CBRS, non-line of sight technology, had become commercialized enough that you didn't have to stick a big ugly something or other on your house. It basically is, this big of a receiver. And it's certainly more expensive to deploy than line of sight, but it works really well given the geological challenges and leafy challenges that we have. And so CARES Act money came along. I have to thank our state senator at the time. He pushed the county commissioners really hard to take some of their CARES Act money and put it into broadband. And they did so, and we went from being a 2-county cog to a 5-county cog because in order for us to build per the PUC, they needed to be a member. So we built out, and what I've never understood about broadband, because we talked about it and Adele talked about it earlier, these are 2, 3, 5-year builds that we're talking about. Every time I build broadband, it is like a sprint. Because CARES Act money was like, sure, build out broadband. You have 4 days, go. It's everything is like that. The original FCC challenge process. Oh, we have new maps. You have 4 days. Go. What? I just found out about this. So we put up 16 tower sites. I have never actually needed an act of Congress until the end of 2020, and I waited with bated breath for the president at the time to sign the bill that extended the CARES Act, because otherwise I was going to be in major default because we had a snowstorm and could not complete the build. So it was finally completed in mid-2021. And we now have 22 sites across 5 counties. Truthfully, it can serve about 90,000 people. We only claim about 23,000 because we got sick of the challenges. We just backed it all off. But that was all CARES Act build. And now, we're looking at what's the next thing. Because to Adil's point, we know that we have customers now on CBRS. And this is commercial grade, carrier grade commercial equipment. This is not, knockoff whatever. It's the real deal. But we know 100 by 100 is not going to cut it really soon. And so what do we do next? And how do we stay relevant? And we still don't know what that looks like. We're in planning. I mean, I met Brian through Connect Humanity. They got an Arise grant from ARC. We've been doing planning through that. And have learned even more. And I was just saying earlier to Dave, I was like, when I built wireless, all I did was drive anywhere and was looking at mountaintops at the towers, and now all I look at are utility poles. And that's when I question my life choices. So quite frankly. But that's really sort of our next big question is, how do we fund this? And what does that look like? Because the unserved, underserved, so we have, in our 5-county region, we have like 107,000 BSLs-ish. There's only 10,000 that are BEAD qualified. And are they all in one spot? Hell no. They're just across the map. And we're trying to get our arms around what does that look like? How does anybody, not necessarily us, but anyone, as much as we would love to continue to build open access, that's the thing. Our network, we own it, we don't operate it. Dave runs on it, we've got another ISP on it. I could take more ISPs, I would gladly have more ISPs on it to serve more people faster. But we don't know what that looks like yet, and that's the part we're trying to figure out is, and quite frankly, and this is, not necessarily PBDA, I've yelled at Adil because I'm like, you were at NTIA, and slap him around for the stupid ideas they had. Okay. He's like, no, they were well thought out at the time. I'm like, no. He's like, we thought it was cool. I'm like, fine. But there are challenges. Like the match requirement is batshit crazy for a municipal entity to try and figure out how to do. I have 5 sets of county commissioners. Do you think any of them want to let me issue a municipal bond? They're like, oh no. It would be great. We pitched that idea. I had Adil come and talk fast with them, and they were like, no. So we don't know what that looks like. But even if we were going to bond it, does that meet the requirement? And I haven't seen the finalized volume 2, so I don't know what it looks like. But if we're going to bond it, I don't know that I can produce the required letter saying, yes, you have the money. I don't know that. There are lots of things that are unfortunately leaning away from municipal broadband as it relates to BEAD. And certainly, I don't have to beat the point because Adil already did and said Pennsylvania is a not muni-friendly state. I can attest to that. So it continues to be, it's important to my commissioners. I have one in particular though who was like, look, our network does not need to make $1 zillion and fund our organization in perpetuity. He said, we just need to make the people who do this for a living do it better. He's like, I didn't have broadband running down my street forever because he lives in the middle of nowhere in Snyder County. And about 8 months to a year after we built our network, suddenly the cable company pulled their head up out of the ground and was like, oh, hey, we should go serve all of these places. And he finally left our network because he paid them $1 bazillion to run fiber right to his house because they were finally going down his street. And he's like, I don't care if we aren't the final solution. I care that my constituents got an answer. And I can 100% as an economic developer see where he's coming from. Do I want my network to be the greatest thing ever? Absolutely. But I don't know what that looks like in 2, 3, 5, 10 years down the road without running fiber. And running fiber absolutely terrifies me, which is a really good way to segue to Dave, because Dave went from wireless to fiber, although I'm gonna let Laura do it. I'll let you actually segue, but I can take questions. I don't know, other things related to if there are other questions folks have or another topic you want me to hit on. But I feel like my job here is comic relief and specific examples.
All right. No questions immediately? Nothing? No clarifications? All right. All right, then I guess we will segue to Dave, last but not least.
Thank you.
Dave's been involved in, running an ISP since 2015 or so. And you liked it so much, you started another one, right? So Black Bear. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about, I guess, Black Bear's fiber model.
Yeah, thank you very much. So my name is Dave Gibbons. I'm an ISP operator and have been in the wireless and fiber ISP space since 2015. We started in 2015 focusing on completely unserved areas. So this was an area, Spring Mills, Pennsylvania, where in 2015 there was only access to Verizon DSL And as many of you who are involved in broadband have probably heard, when new customers tried to call that company to get signed up, they often heard, "We're out of ports, we can't connect your home." This was a really common refrain. So I fell into broadband in 2015, servicing some business customers in Spring Mills because there was nothing better. We built this, what at the time was crazy complicated wireless network that actually bounced wireless signals from State College up to Tussey Mountain kind of area and then back down into Spring Mills. So several hops, and started with a handful of business customers down there and grew from there out to residences and many, many more businesses. So we very much started with a need. And I think if you look at many of the small regional or local ISPs that exist in Pennsylvania, they will tell you a very similar story, right? We started with a need. The incumbent wouldn't build out. The incumbent wanted $50,000 to run cable down our last mile, yada, yada, yada. And it's interesting, we use a software package that a lot of other small regional ISPs use. And I had a call with our sales rep a few weeks ago and he said, "I don't know what it is. I've got like 5 customers within 100 miles in Pennsylvania. You guys are a breeding ground in PA for these small regional ISPs." And I told him that the reality is that incumbents have long ignored these areas that are difficult to solve. They have intentionally not served areas where they didn't think they had a good business case. And as a result, you had a bunch of entrepreneurs jump in and say, "I think I could probably solve that problem." And a lot of these smaller local and regional ISPs kind of cropped up through that reality. So we came from the need, and that's how many of us got into the business. So we were in and out for a little bit around 2018, got back in 2019 through a contract with Center County to build out broadband using some of their existing vertical assets, their 911 towers. And it's hard for me to describe this because this was all pre-COVID. It's like a before and after. But through then that growth and some of the CARES Act funding that came out during COVID, we were able to expand into a number of other counties in partnership with county governments, CEDACOG, regional development kind of groups as well. So today we serve thousands of customers across both wireless and fiber, primarily in central Pennsylvania and the Center County, Mifflin, Juniata regions. And we are actively in the process of overbuilding our wireless footprint with fiber to the home. Again, these are primarily unserved and underserved areas, but as we talk about how you connect fiber from unserved and underserved, there's a middle mile piece there that is demanded. So we, as we build that middle mile, tend to service homes off of it as well. It's already there, the infrastructure is there. So we like to service those homes. I think to tie this back to current grant funding opportunities and economic development and things like that, it's really important to acknowledge the reality that as a small ISP, if I want to build a big project, which is what it looks like is going to be required for BEAD funding, I'm going to need a lot of money for match, right? Mm-hmm. So even the larger regional ISPs are serving a few thousand customers. I think that's a pretty average size for a small regional ISP. When you talk about a big fiber project, let's say $50,000 a mile for fiber in that ballpark is a good number to work with. You start to get into the many millions of dollars for match very quickly, right? And when you talk about that type of a match, it demands funding from somewhere. It's no longer a amount of funding that as a smaller ISP you can fund with a bank loan or out of profits or something like that. It demands funding, right? So then we get into private equity, basically. If you want to go get a bunch of money on a hope and a dream, you're looking at private equity. And the challenge there, right, we're going to tie this together, thanks for bearing with me. The challenge when you get into private equity is it presupposes an outcome. Brian spoke earlier about what private equity firms are looking for. They're not looking for 2 or 3% interest. They're looking for 30 or 40 or 50% return on investment. That's the nature of private equity. That's why they exist, right? And as a small rural ISP, if I want to go and get $5 or $10 or $20 million in match funding from private equity, they're not going to be happy for the most part, except for a few boutique firms that are focused on missions rather than profits with 2 or 3 or 4, honestly even 10% rate of return. They want to flip that and get 50 or 100% in a few years. So the interesting thing from my perspective is that as we look at the match requirements for BEAD and look at how that applies in reality to smaller regional ISPs, if I go and apply for BEAD and I bring private equity with me and they bring $10 million, 3 or 4 years down the line, the outcome is pre-written. It's presupposed by my application. It has to be sold because I have to give the rate of return to the private equity investor that they want. And when it's sold, it will be gobbled up by the same incumbents who we all got in business in the first place to compete against because they refused to service some of these locations in a reasonable way or at a reasonable cost. So we have a really major challenge here around match as it relates to smaller regional ISPs, because if you want a bunch of money for a big project for a match, you've written the end of the story before you filled in the middle in terms of how it needs to be flipped. And that kind of feeds into this idea that incumbents created the digital divide. We are funding companies to now solve the digital divide, but we are putting requirements in place that are going to feed that vicious cycle again, right? So if I go to sell a telecom company in 4 years, it's probably going to be sold to an incumbent. And then we're going to repeat that cycle wherein they won't extend the last mile to the very, very rural person. We'll probably have another funding stream at some point, and we're going to rinse and repeat. So I don't think there's been enough reflection on the realities that while I fully understand the match and the desire at a government level to talk about building jobs and creating investment in Pennsylvania by matching funds, that match has to come from somewhere. And when you tie together a big project and that brings with it a big match, it creates truly a very significant challenge for small ISPs if we want to try to avoid feeding those monopolies in the future. And I know they're not monopolies on paper, but de facto, we have ISP monopolies in Pennsylvania. I'd love a question about that.
I think we've got a question over here.
Oh, I'm
Do you
sorry.
mind- Do you mind an interruption?
No, you should keep going. This is,
Okay.
like,
All right.
if you have more than the same one, then I'll ask.
Yeah.
No, I think I hit on the important points.
So all three of you talked about match, right? Hypothetically, you might be in a room with people who have influence on how the program is run, perhaps.
Yep.
What are 2 or 3 things you think, right? First, one question is about match specifically to the point you're making, Dave, which is why not figure out a way to do debt rather than equity, right? So why not figure out about like a revenue bond that's tied to the generation, et cetera, that sort of idea, which, it's newer but it exists, right? Or partner with the municipality to try and figure out debt or, RUS or whatever. So how about debt? That's the first question. Then secondly, what could the Pennsylvania Broadband Authority, could the state do, right? What are 2 or 3 things they could do that are tangible to make it easier for you to apply whenever this window opens in let's call it the fall, right? So that you could do the kind of high-speed, low-cost project that I sort of made a big pitch for, right? Is there any 2 or 3 things they could do that would make that plausible? The answer is
Let me add to that too, because the model you're talking about, one of our we remind us communication. I'm realizing how lucky we are in that communication unit districts, because we are accessing municipal bonds. But the ISPs are working with us in the community networks. I'm going to piggyback what you said, because I think that's the answer. I don't know how. You're not going to be successful with equity, because the match, when I heard that $4,200 number, you got to put another, 1,010 on that, whatever it is, 1,050 on that, and that gets 30% equity. That's a recipe for failure.
Right.
But we've had a lot of great cooperation with the ISPs to ride on the networks. That's exactly how we're doing it, right? We're investing in the networks using low interest municipal bonds, and what I've learned I was a former CEO of an electric cooperative. Prior knowledge, I had to get 3 years of a debt service coverage ratio over 1.25. These muni investors now will give us immediate. You don't have to wait 3 years for the deals. As long as you can show you got a debt service coverage ratio of 1.25 or better, you immediately get funding. So I think that's the answer. What you just said, having the private, you're gonna make your money, but you're gonna fail with that model.
So three things that the authority or like the state could do to make the process for each of you, right? I mean, what can they do that's just tangible? It can be small, it can be big. Like, okay, in this process as it goes forward, if these three things would make it infinitely easier for me to submit a plausible, sustainable, awesome application in October or whatever it may be.
We're too late for changes though, right?
I'm
I
gonna
think it's a
throw
good question, right? So here's some
out-
realities.
There's something, not all.
The authority in PA, and I think the rest of the authorities in the other states are set up in a similar way in that they're small groups of people, right? They're getting a ton of applications for a ton of money. They have a huge weight on their shoulders. They are not that many people. So they're incentivized by virtue of the fact that they are small groups of people to look at applicants who can submit big projects or multiple projects wherein they can vet the applicant once and award multiple projects to that single applicant or those single applicants. That is opposed to where small ISPs are coming from, which is that because we're connected to the community and because we're smaller, we're inclined to submit smaller applications that are maybe really, really good at serving the need in the communities that we live in and operate in and have really deep connections in, but aren't so big that they hit a huge swath of the state all at once. So those two things are opposed, right?
What's the number of locations that feels like a manageable chunk at a project area? Is it 100? Is it 1,000?
I think it's 1,000 to several thousand as we look at project areas and densities per mile of between 10 and 50 homes.
You know, the other thing, as I look at your presentation, the other thing that dooms us to this old technology is the extremely high cost location threshold. Because now what happens is if you can't serve it with fiber, now you fall back to this extremely high cost and then give a poor answer, right?
And I want to be clear about if you can't serve it with fiber. We are in a unique situation in Pennsylvania wherein a lot of folks will come in and say, well, we can't serve it with fiber, so we'll put up CBRS gear that can kind of go through trees, we can serve them. There are very, very, very few places in Pennsylvania where you can put a reasonable number of towers up
Right.
and build reasonable infrastructure to them and be cheaper per mile than fiber to serve those homes. And the reason is the hills and valleys and the trees. So there are lots and lots and lots of engineering firms that have released models around this. It's really dubious if you really drill into what the received signal level is through trees during rain, over mountains, things like that, that wireless is cheaper than fiber. I think what I'll submit to you there is, and I don't think WISPA is here, although I saw FISPA, which is great. WISPA is the wireless ISP industry organization, and they love to talk about net adds for fixed wireless. Every single month on LinkedIn, they say, big cable lost 70,000 subs, fixed wireless added XYZ subs, right? What you're seeing is that fixed wireless is quick to build. So it's a leading indicator of customer dissatisfaction with traditional ISPs. But how they're spinning it, and I disagree with this on principle, is that it's somehow an assertion that fixed wireless is a great replacement technology to a fiber wired into a home. I don't believe it is. I believe it's a quick way for consumers to say, I don't like the incumbent anymore, I'm gonna switch. And I think what you'll see over the next few years, assuming we get fiber into more and more places, is that a lot of those fixed wireless ads that are rural will disappear back to the wireline provider as the service becomes fiber and therefore becomes more reliable.
Just picking up on something in between the lines there, it's like, from the small projects versus the large projects, it's really just the transaction costs that's involved, whether it's selecting the application. If you had to then go find the match for 5 small projects versus 1 large project, right? Like that's 5 different deal teams talking to, maybe even the same set of investors. It's going to be impossible. So we've seen this not only on the investor side, but also on the foundation side if you're trying to get philanthropy to the table. And so I think one, and just from an economics, for folks in the room, if you're talking to ISVs, WISPs that we've talked to want to make their money back in 6 to 9 months, and so that's like their target ROI. For private equity, the numbers that we're seeing, given the valuations that we're getting from investment banks, is they assume 25-cent match. They put in 25 cents on the dollar now to get $1 of BEAD infrastructure. The way debt capital markets are right now for larger private equity investors, banks are willing to lend to them at 50% loan to value of the project. So private equity is actually putting in 12.5 cents to own a dollar network on day one once it's constructed. With valuation multiples have grown 2 to 2.5x over the last 5 years, which is a huge spike from where they were in the 2010s. And it's really over the last 5 years. So that implies that they'd be selling the network for $2 to $3 to whoever the next buyer is. So private equity math here is 12.5 cents of equity in to get $2 to $3 out in the next 5 to 7 years. What would I like? That would be helpful. I think from a transaction cost perspective, like if there was a bigger pool of match funding that small ISPs could access, it doesn't need to be fully funded by the state, but if the state could help catalyze that with state-based, regional-based, place-based, philanthropy, you bring in along like community finance into that as well. You could theoretically grow a decent-sized pool to help fund some of the match even before you get to muni. Yeah.
Is there any help in timing, right? So let's say the round one, the first part of the application's in September, right? And you're gonna be the presumptive winner in February, right? So that's like a 5-month delta, right? So your point, Jennifer, like I don't know I can put like, if they offered like a lighter promise up front, right? We think we'll create this match, right? Now here's like all the proof that I can fund it, just we'll do it, right? And then I don't have to prove the funding until I'm like in the last 2 or 3 like likely winners, right? Does that make a difference, or is that sort of like some
Well,
hypothetical?
I mean, it kind of does, because there's certainly in this part that's unclear, like there's the bonding piece, like that's still a little unclear, like when that has to be in. But certainly if the match requirement was later, I mean, it makes a difference. I still have to get it though. I mean, and we're in the process now as part of what we're doing with Connect Humanity of like we have we've partnered with NRTC out of DC, and they're doing the generic network engineering because I can't get details on poles and whatnot. But what would it take to serve all of the communities that have, or all the municipalities that have 20% or greater as unserved, underserved, because like we're just not going to be able to hit them all for any kind of normal rational number, and so we're trying to figure out does the math work and is there a business case, because right now the only thing we're looking at as a plausible solution is a revenue bond, that long term we can utilize to fund that and capitalize some of the OpEx early on, things like that. So, if it were not until like, yeah, we're gonna do it, because like, I'm not gonna go float a bond until I know I'm doing it, and I'm not, and I've got commissioners who are, it's not a municipal bond, it would be a revenue bond, because I mean, but it's possible they might be more likely, like, oh yeah, we know we're gonna get this, or we've made it through this hoop, and this hoop.
Right.
Now we can go get it. That might change the calculus, because right now they're like, because all they hear is like, municipal bond and what if we default on it? I'm like,
And that actually doesn't necessarily solve Dave's problem, right? Because
Right,
then it's
no.
like that presupposes a larger one, because there is a minimum threshold on what can be municipally financed. So then at that point, the muni has to take on
You're
even
like
more
10
risk, because then you're then the quarterback to try to like split it up in two. And so I think fundamentally underlying some of this is like, what are the nature of the bills that are left, right? And I think when some of the folks that we've talked to are still on the assumption that there's lots of 10, 20, 30, 40,000 household builds remaining, which are the larger mega projects types. If most of the rural builds that we've seen are pockets, right? Thousands here or there, maybe even hundreds, or just right, like, so that type of project creation and financing is just radically different.
Because the state, I realize we're different in Vermont, but we managed to get our state legislature to come up with the match money for our municipal networks. I'm bouncing on your idea. Is there any chance that your state legislature?
Remember how when he did his presentation, your little bar was green and ours was red?
Yeah, right.
Sorry, I'm gonna beat that one to death, because that's my biggest gripe, is that, it doesn't affect us, because we've already jumped through all the hoops required, but there's nothing about Pennsylvania that says we wanna see the very stuff that Brian's crew has found is really successful and gets people on board. There's nothing in Pennsylvania that makes that easy. I mean, it's just banging your head against a wall every single day, to try and get through those hoops. Because it is just the nature of the beast at this point.
And let me just throw the frisbee, because what we found to be successful is folks like Dave.
Yeah, no, 100%.
I think I saw a hand also, yeah.
Yes, hi, I'm Shelby Hinkle with the American Section 4. I had a question, I guess, to all of you, because it encompasses all of you. We talk a lot about like the Act 183 and how that's such a stick in the mud of like it would solve so many problems if we got it removed. Would it be better to try to increase our funding for the match? So I know a lot of states are giving extra budgets for communities that can't meet the match requirement, the 25%. Or would it be more effective to us to put our money and our energy into lobbying to get Act 183?
Yes,
Both?
yes.
Okay.
Let me give you some, sorry.
But no, go ahead.
Let me give you some nuance on the match. So one of the challenges that smaller ISPs ran into in the last round of capital projects fund in Pennsylvania that was just funded is that the match requirement was listed as 25%, right? So what we need to understand with deep clarity is the match requirement a threshold or is it a sliding scale? If I go from 25 to 50 on the match, do I get more points than if I get a binary yes, no for meeting the match? So things like that are easy to miss when you're reviewing some of these requirements for a program. They're really, really, really important. If everything else is equal, if we're all doing fiber and we all have community involvement and all that kind of stuff, same ratio of unserved, underserved, everything like that comes down to match, right? Am I getting a 0 or a 1, or am I getting anywhere from 0 to 10 if I go from 25 to 68 or 70% match?
And it's not an in-kind match either, right?
It can be.
It can be.
Right.
There are some rules for in-kind. I could give you a ton of commentary there, but I'll stop.
Well,
In-kind is a challenge for small providers because large providers can use in-kind match to fudge the numbers.
Right.
If you got a high-rise full of people that are all overhead salary, all of a sudden you have a bunch of in-kind you can apply however you want, and it probably doesn't truly relate to the project. But I'll stop there. I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna
No,
say,
I
because
was
I can speak to Act 183. Like I said, we've jumped through the hoops, we've spent the money, we've fought it out with ILEX, but the problem is because it's in place. First of all, I will say, and this is my one soapboxy thing, and I don't know. Again, I have not seen the final volume, but the language in the initial volume about this is an opportunity for communities to partner with incumbents and whatever I can't remember exactly what it said. That, in my view of the universe and in my personal experience, is naive because they don't want to partner with municipalities. Incumbents want nothing to do with municipal. There's a reason why that law exists, because they were trying to keep out what communities wanted to, they wanted to keep communities out. They wanted to preserve that monopoly, right? So there is no world in which the Verizons and the Comcasts and the Windstreams of the world are going to call the me's or my colleagues from around the state and be like, we're ready to play ball with you. They'll call me and say, how can you help me build my network better? Maybe. Or how can you help me get in with those commissioners that you have a great relationship with? But they're not calling to do a partnership and to help, put a network together. That is not happening. So Act 183 will continue to be a barrier in Pennsylvania because particularly now, like it was easy when I built Montour County because it was just Verizon. They were like, we don't care what you do. They were not interested at that point in time. They were worried about, their wireless network. They were not putting money into their DSL. I don't know if that would change going forward. When we did the CARES Act, I suddenly had 7 ILECs to deal with. And 2 of them got cranky about it, and the rest of them just sort of capitulated because they needed to. And it cost us, as Dill said, $200,000 to fight it out because it's a really straightforward law, but it got twisted into I don't even know what. So it's there for a reason, and it is not meant to it's meant to not make it easy for municipalities or any governmental entity to play ball. And you can't go, I mean, there are ways around it. Brandon's a smart guy, he figured it out. They did it in Southern Allegheny, so there's a great way to get around it. But like, you can't just stand up a municipal authority because you can't create a municipal authority to compete with existing business. So, there's a couple of ways around it, but not many.
So I'm generally pessimistic around. I think so. I think it feels like it's just been a swirl of failure of private markets, failure of regulatory framework, and failure of capital markets, right? Because capital, like that cost just gets passed through. And so I think when a lot of what we've tried to structure in our financing is to kind of say like, F it all. Like if we just had to serve this community, taking private market actors as constraints, regulatory framework for as it is without changing it, how could we structure something that kind of threaded the needle of all of that, right? And so we've been able to do community broadband where it's community owned, and that in Louisiana, that sale leaseback, where we've written into the foundation's governance documents, it effectively acts like a co-op. And the foundation is not allowed to sell its assets. So, if for any future, governors or directors of it, they wouldn't be able to make a payday off of it. So we've been able to mimic a lot of the dynamics without having to, go through a lot of the battles of changing certain laws or getting certain agreements. That presupposes a lot of friendly capital. And so one of the things we've been trying to do in conjunction with the New York Fed and Dallas and Philly Feds has been to say, how do we get community finance and impact investors and philanthropy more at the table? Because if you can pool the amount of capital markets, like not grant philanthropy, right, but actually return seeking, could community the same role that CDFIs, community development finance institutions, the role that they played to expand affordable housing in this country, could they play the same role with broadband infrastructure? Low cost, patient capital, deep knowledge and ties to the community, their ability to weave in tax credits for large infrastructure projects, it rhymes a lot. I think they're just
The rules were changed 2 years ago to make that easier.
exactly, and the new CRA rules for banks too. And so there's a lot that just hasn't been activated yet.
So I think it's really important to talk about the bad actors, and in particular, so Verizon is the shards of AT&T, which dating back to 1913 made a commitment, the Kingsbury commitment, to provide services in return for not having its monopoly power challenged. Things got so bad that we broke up AT&T in 1984, the 1984 divestiture, broke it up into a bunch of baby bells, one of which is Verizon. And Verizon, directly after 84, starts consolidating power. Like Act 183 a decade later, like the Chapter 30 quid pro quo, where they're giving huge tax subsidies in return for 45 megabit symmetric service commitments, which they don't do. 2002, March 28, the PUC of Pennsylvania declares you are failing to live up to those commitments. Every year, every decade, every century, this company screws us over. Fast forward to now, and they are the largest recipient of new public funding in return for a commitment that they have a 100+ year history of screwing us over. So yes, I'm pessimistic, but only because we seem to fail to appreciate 100 years of documentation as to what the business model is.
I just to respond on a couple points. I think one is being relatively newer to the space, I have found it fascinating to see how inaccessible it is. And how much jargon there is used to communicate what otherwise is a pretty simple idea. And so, having to wade through that, like the technical aspect of it, I have to assume like that short-term memory of it is just like, holy shit, don't talk to me about GPON again, right? Like, what did that even mean? And so there's just that, I have a suspicion at least, or at least in some of the conversations I have with funds. Another fascinating one, I forget who I mentioned this to. I was talking to a regional foundation of note, fairly large name in the space, and explaining to them how there were different models to connect. Like you didn't have to go with an incumbent. And the response was, well, isn't that just providing second-class internet service to poor people? And had to unpack, no, same equipment, same, you know, bill of materials, if not better service, and here's, you know, all the surveys that show top 10 ISPs are non-incumbent, and it would not stick. And so, effective marketing branding campaigns, but it's been interesting to see how sticky a lot of that is.
I think we have time for one more response from the panel. Okay.
Well,
Into
I mean,
one more
obviously,
question.
if other people have questions, so look, if you were the broadband authority or whatnot, right? Your goal is, right, to get as many people to apply as possible, because if you have competitive applications for regions, you have some choice and you can possibly get the best deal. And let's be clear, they have to put out a certain amount of subsidy and make it stretch, right? So they gotta get this to work, right? I don't mean to speak for the audience, but it's pretty clear that like you're feeling very, very overwhelmed, right? That like and if you guys are this way and you were on this panel, right, then who are the people who didn't even make it to the room, right? It seems like right now there's a sort of substantial gap between the seeming friendliness of the possibilities, right? And there's also this question, it sounds like, one, how friendly and easy can the application process be to make it so that I can try and do this without poking my eyes out, right? And then two, there's this like funding question, it sounds like, right? Are there, like, so the funding question is interesting because like you've got public potential debt, right, that can be done in big chunks. And private players don't use it, right? Like you seem like there's like, because these are the alternative, right? The small players and then the municipal players, like they can all work together. I already pitched this, it's not like I'm hiding my cards on that, right? There's public-private partnership which people say they want, right? So like, I think the question would be, and you don't have to answer it on the panel, but like, how can you reflect on what it would really take, right, to make the process feel possible, right? What's it gonna take? And I mean, you offer your thoughts on it, but like recognizing that literally the government agency people, they're a small group of people, but they need it to be possible, right? Like they can't actually do the job if they don't have anybody else apply. Like they will not be able, they'll get stuck, right? Because the way the numbers work, they'll just get stuck, right? So I guess it's a challenge for you, right? Like after this, how do you build the what it would take? Like it's yes if, right?
I would answer that by saying we've answered a lot of these questions already, right? So standard government procurement processes prioritize small businesses, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses. There are historical things we can look at. I know everybody likes to trash RDOF, but RDOF was a program that was created to solve this problem, to allow the free market to work through the reverse auction and to vet ISPs in a two-stage process, so there wasn't a huge upfront burden, to your bonding statement earlier, to get involved. And then if you got ahead in the auction, then you proved you could do it and you could fund it and all those kinds of things. So at the risk of being really, really long-winded, I would say we've answered a lot of these questions already. I think we need to look to those historical operations and take some advice out of those books.
And I would also add, a third of RDOF funds are now in default. And when you look at the entities that are defaulting, they're almost all for-profit private entities. You know who's not defaulting? Co-ops, municipal entities, and et cetera. And yet, in the face of recent empirical evidence as to which business models are more successful, we keep funding the ones that keep defaulting.
Who does the broadband director report to in the state?
DCD secretary, he's sitting right there.
It's right there.
You can ask him.
It's an open question. There's a
Secretary
board.
of DCED.
Well, there's an authority, right? So
Right.
Kyle's in this room, he's on it, there's a funding
11-member
authority
board.
that's got an interesting structure that's,
Well, the reason I asked that is I actually found the NTIA to be very cooperative with what Vermont was trying to do. You know, I'm going to publicly say it, very pleased with the negotiations we've had with the NTIA. So, you know, it does fall on the broadband office as well. So, you know, to represent you. So beat them up.
Oh.
We do.
Brandon.
We do.
Well, Brandon, I've set you up, to Brandon,
Yeah,
hands
so
you.
Look, jokes aside, they have a really difficult
Oh, I
job
know
and
they
they have a very compressed timeline.
Yeah.
It is,
Yes.
and I
I
have
it's
and
too
will
late to beat
continue
them
to
up,
beat
too.
Brandon up.
Yeah.
They have a very, 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 very short amount of time to build a lot of fiber. It's not easy. I don't envy the position.
And our state refuses to invest in broadband or the broadband office.
So, yeah, that's why I asked the question. If you report to the governor, it's a state problem.
but I guess, I mean, candidly,
But you get the government you deserve, right? So,
there's a whole bunch of states with fewer people.
so Pennsylvania, what are you doing? Why do you have this government?
Well, thank you so much for this great conversation.